Brilliant. So welcome everyone. Thank you, Kai, for the introduction again. And welcome to our third Wednesday seminar. So in our talk today, we're going to be looking at one of kind of these big archaeology questions, which is how do places become urban? And how do you go from a place that's not a town yet, or is not even a settlement yet, like here's estuary in Suffolk, and how does it become a town like Ipswich? And the case study of this presentation today is probably one of the more important places in British archaeology, in particular in the study of how towns came about in Great Britain. And yet it's one of the more underloved places in British archaeology, and that is Ipswich in Suffolk. So Ipswich is a type of settlement which is known to medievalists as an emporia, emporium is singular. And emporia are these settlements that engage in long-distance trade, usually on the coast, the sort of ports around the North Sea and also the Baltic Sea and English Channel. And they appeared in this period between the years 650 and 850 as the kind of re-beginning of urbanism after the decline of the Western Roman Empire. So after the supposed counter-urbanization and the decline of towns in the 5th and 6th centuries, this kind of winter of urbanity, urbanity kind of re-emerged in the spring as these emporia. This was the first little hint. These are the daffodils of urbanism that appeared in Northern Europe between 650 and 850. And they're identified archaeologically based off of crafts, firstly. And there's all sorts of very interesting crafts at these settlements. So there's glass blowing and metalworking and blacksmithing and pottery, tanning and bone and antler working. If you saw Ian Riddler's presentation last month, that was about that exact craft in Emporia there. But they have other characteristics that would make them seem urban. They encompass a large area. They have loads of structures. They have metalled roads. It's worth saying also that these places aren't necessarily ecclesiastical royal centers. Some of them do have cathedrals, and some of them have the sense of being kind of a political center, but others do not. For example, Hamwick has less evidence of being kind of a royal center which is Southampton, than nearby Winchester. Right? And many of the Scandinavian emporia didn't have churches or cathedrals, at least until very late in history, if they did at all. Now, if you go to places like the Jorvik Viking Center, which is where this photo in the background was taken, you also get the sense that these were kind of marketplaces, these kind of bustling centers, where not only are people producing things and maybe living there, but also places where people are engaging in trade. So if that's true, then we definitely kind of give a sense that this is an early urban space. It's certainly very different than the other types of settlements that existed elsewhere in Anglo-Saxon England. We kind of have the sense that the emporia are these places where people are coming from all over. So you could have Frankish merchants running their hands on Baltic amber and Viking from the fjords displaying slaves on the Western Isles. And you have potters and artisans pocketing coins with the profiles of unfamiliar kings or runic alphabets on them. This kind of intersection of nations is sort of an everyday fact. And this exists in the historical record too, as these places of being a mart of many nations, with people coming to it from both oversea and overland. Where, yeah, basically people of all sorts of languages and talks and trades are coming together. They're sort of the Mos Eisleys of Anglo-Saxon England. So just to give you a quick diagram, these are some of the better recognized and known emporia. And this is where they exist in Northern Europe. Great Britain has 4, all kind of in the eastern half. Ioffawick in the north is York. To the south is Gipswick, which is Ipswich. Then Londonwick, which is, of course, London. And then Hamwick, which is Southampton. These generally are the better known ones. Gipswick has been long identified as one of these emporia, but it hasn't always had the attention it deserves. And Ipswich is important for a number of reasons, and we'll talk about that now. So first, let me show you actually this map here, because you're going to be seeing a lot of maps in my presentation, and I want you to be kind of familiar with what's going on in these maps. Basically, Ipswich includes over 60 excavations, only about 5 of which have been published. And the excavations are not only underpublished, but they have very rarely referenced in other secondary sources as well. Everything exists in the grey literature or in archives in Suffolk. On this map, every single one of these pink polygons is an excavation extent. And of course, there's the River Orwell there, which is an estuary connecting the settlement to the North Sea. But all the area in white is unexcavated. And when we go through with this talk and when we think about the archaeology of many urban places, really, there's this problem where there's a very big cloud over what we cannot see, and a fog of the modern urban space, which blocks us from excavating the entire settlement. And it's definitely the case where one new big excavation could really change our understanding of the town. So we're really kind of playing with crumbs here. It's kind of sugar dissolved in water, and we're trying to understand the sugar. But what you're also seeing on this map are these columns coming out of the excavation extent, and those sort of represent the volume, or actually the mass of the artifacts recovered. So you can see the biggest are north of the river, and there's sort of like 5 or 6 major excavations, and then a whole bunch of ones that are relatively small. Ipswich may be one of the earliest emporia. It's certainly, as early as the rest. So it's either the first or tied for first of the earliest English emporia. And there's a great mass of artifacts recovered, like I've said, but very few are published. And Ipswich is similar in many ways to the other excavation extents, similar in many ways to the other emporia in Northern Europe. There is a lot of evidence of crafts. There's, again, a large area encompassed, almost 20 hectares. And there are metal roads and loads of structures and evidence of occupation. But Ipswich is different from the other emporia in a number of interesting ways. One difference is actually it's more extreme in its production, at least in pottery. Ipswich had this almost industrial scale production of this type of pottery. Not a very pretty one, but a kind of, this kind of standard mass producible one, which is called Ipswichware. And Ipswichware is found all throughout the eastern half of what's now England in the 8th and 9th century, about 700 to about 850. And there's no other emporia that had that level of production, at least in England, of a particular artifact type. But also Ipswich is different from the other emporia because of its continuity, which is that many of the other emporia began and then died out, but Ipswich continued and from an emporium to the present day. So to give an example of discontinuous emporia, this is London, right? So Londonburg was the location of Londinium, the Roman settlement that was London, basically in the city of London today, where St. Paul's is. And then London Wick was established in the, if you can call it that, 7th or 8th century, but it's not in London, it's not Londinium, it's not in the Roman center. That was ostensibly abandoned, and a new settlement was built here. But then in about the 9th century, maybe 10th century, London Wick was abandoned. And this area, which is kind of Aldwych area now, the area was, discarded, discontinued. And instead activity happened again in the city of London and Westminster. And similar fates befell the other emporia. Burke and Dorstadt were abandoned. Joffawick and Hamwick kind of changed location like London did. Hedeby and Cowpeng were abandoned, and so were Quintovic and Reba. The only one really that continued, that didn't get abandoned in that sort of 9th century time, was Ipswich. And you can see by kind of imposing the archaeology on this early modern map, and then again on the modern Ordnance Survey map, that actually Ipswich went from an emporium to an early modern town to a 21st century town without ever having to go through a period of abandonment and without ever having to put its shoes on. Yeah. And the fact that the town continued from the emporium to the town makes it a really interesting case study for understanding the evolution and emergence of urbanity and towns in early medieval England. because you're basically going from a non-urban settlement to something that's kind of urban-like, this kind of middle ground emporium, which has urban characteristics, and then going directly from there into something that is like a town, and it evolves, kind of continuously through that period. And while there's a lot of change, the location certainly remains the same, and it seems that it was always a town, at least by Doomsday Book. And the archaeology suggests it goes all the way back to the age of the Emporia in the 7th century. So this adds interesting questions. Why is it that Ipswich continued and became town-like when the other locations, the other Emporia, did not? And then the other question, which we'll touch on because it links to this very closely and it's very interesting, is who founded these settlements? And the two ways this is usually kind of framed is that it was either established by kings, sort of wanting to control trade going into their kingdoms, or that it was established by merchants kind of collaboratively as a way to kind of share resources or kind of share their strengths, or maybe even for security of being all in one place. As they were kind of traveling through the North Sea, they could gather in particular settlements. Or is it something else entirely? Yeah. So we're going to explore that. The rest of this talk is kind of divided into two sections. First, we're going to look at the evidence of archaeology in Ipswich. And then we're going to think about ways that we can study this question using some, not novel, but different methods. Okay. I'll also say that the period of study for this research and my PhD is 600 to 900. So that takes us back to right as the Emporium was beginning at Ipswich, up until the period when the other Emporia have been abandoned, but Ipswich is still a thriving town, more or less. Right. So I'll show you these two maps to compare. This is Ipswich as it would have appeared in about the year 650. There are two large cemeteries, one to the north called Buttermarket Cemetery and a barrow cemetery to the south on the south bank of the river, which I guess you call the Stoke Quay Cemetery. You can look on the map, you see there's a 40-meter ditch over here, kind of the northeastish. That may have been part of one large kind of farm boundary, or maybe a kind of boundary for herders to kind of gather the livestock in. There's a well over by the river, and there's a couple of Grubenhäuser, and there's lots of open space over by the estuary. I should say for Ipswich, we're really lucky in the fact that most of the excavations, a very large majority, excavated all the way to the natural. So most of the excavations have gone far enough to uncover activity as early as the 7th century. So we don't get too many false negatives. Having said that, though, the picture on the waterfront, at least on the north bank, is quite blurry and complicated because we know that there was sort of land reclamation in the Anglo-Saxon period in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries as they were depositing earth and kind of claiming land back from the estuary, or at least that's how we think of land reclamation now. But the point is that by doing so, they may have interrupted and removed, or another way, kind of disturbed the archaeology that we would have otherwise found on the waterfront. Now, if we look actually at Ipswich in the 7th century, the only structures we find are two Grubenhäuser, and there's no evidence of roads. Grubenhäuser are small structures, the size of sheds, basically, but with pits. They're not generally conceived to be live-inable houses. Yeah, they're usually either considered workshops or more commonly like storehouses or granaries. Whether or not this is a town, this seems kind of questionable, actually. You have a whole 7th century space here, and only two structures in it, and two sheds don't exactly make a town. However, we do know that long-distance trade was already taking place because we have evidence of continental pottery in our two cemeteries. And the extent to where that's different from other coastal settlements is questionable, but it does seem like the intensity, the volume, the number is a bit higher here than it is in other coastal settlements in the 7th century. Okay. Now, by the end of this phase, by the year 900, not only do we have a whole bunch of roads, but actually our two cemeteries have been covered up by plots and roads and workshops, and we have coppersmithing, we have blacksmithing, we have kilns that are making that Ipswichware pottery. We have roadways, we have a ford. The cemeteries have moved out to the outside of the settlement. And we certainly get a space that seems more characteristic of what we would think of as being urban. So the question is, how do we go from that one to the other? And I'm going to give you a quick case study of one of the more major and better known excavations, which is the Buttermarket Cemetery, just so you can see the type of evidence that exists in Ipswich and how complicated it can be to kind of fit it all together. So yeah, that's the Buttermarket Cemetery. So in that first phase, when we have just the two cemeteries and the two Grubenhäuser in the 7th century, is sort of inhumation cemetery, 102 burials excavated. These green ditches are probably barrows, burial mounds. But then the cemetery is abandoned for an unknown amount of time, and by the second half of the 8th century sometime, the cemetery is replaced by these structures and some pits, and also a road, which is a metalled road, which means it's basically gravel and sand. The road actually knocks down this burial mound there as well. And we don't know for how long the cemetery lasted, and we don't know exactly when these structures were built, but the period of disuse in between lasted somewhere between 30 and 100 years, which is kind of a long time, but not so long that it means that the people who built these would have necessarily forgotten that the cemetery was there or that the cemetery was unknown. The burial mounds in particular probably would have still been standing when they were knocked down for this road. And it's possible that there were people living in the area who had, ancestors that were buried in the cemetery. But nonetheless, structures are built, a road goes through the cemetery. No evidence of crafting, really, although there are some kind of needles and heckling spikes that are indicative of some textile work. But then at the turn of the 9th century, so the kind of following generation, 30 years after that, the space changed again. So the buildings are completely erased, or not erased necessarily, but destroyed, replaced by new structures. Second road appears, going through, again, covering over where other inhumations would have been. These are a series of post holes, probably boardwalks because they're in parallel, but they could just be fences. Either way, they're kind of dividing the space into plots, and within we have structures, including workshops, and where this red dot was a kiln firing, again, Ipswichware. So we're actually going from a cemetery to this kind of structures in a road over the cemetery, to something, again, that's kind of characteristic of urban space, that is plots, crafts activity, roadways, on top of the cemetery within the space of a little over 100 years. And how this happens is a question that, in this case in particular, hasn't been answered yet very well. Is there a deliberate effort to destroy the cemetery? Or is it just a matter of growing the town and the cemetery is the space that's available, or something else entirely? If we go back to that kind of original way of thinking about who founded these towns, was it kings or was it merchants, then we get this idea of, okay, well, maybe it's a legitimate authority like a king who has repurposed the cemetery to permit people to come. So he says, I hereby say the cemetery is no longer for funerals. And anyway, no one has had a funeral here in 70 years, and now we're going to settle it. Or is it that craftspeople and traders are just settling opportunistically, like squatters basically, on the space because it's just what's available, right? It's an open space, so to speak. And this is kind of the old-fashioned way of looking at urban growth. One way of thinking about it is maybe, okay, the quicker, more dramatic change more likely to be is from a legitimate authority. That probably has some truth behind it. But we end up getting stuck in this kind of rut where we're looking at a kind of top-down versus bottom-up history of the town, where we have two opposing forces, or maybe only just one force coming from one direction. Or the way it's often framed in kind of urban history or urban archaeology is that we have a planned versus organic town growth and change. And I think in some ways that's a little unhelpful. And I think the story of Ipswich can be a lot more interesting and have a lot more detail and nuance. And I think probably actually maybe a bit more excitement if we tackle it from a new angle. So now we're going to, for the remainder of this talk, investigate a new method for this, which is material discourse analysis. So the idea behind this basically is that every action in a sedentary society is mediated by an artifact. So for example, eating habits are mediated by farming tools, ovens, glass and ceramic wares, etc. Note that doesn't just mean that ovens and farming tools are indicative of particular eating habits, right? But they also enable those eating habits. Yeah. If you don't have like a pasta bowl, then you wouldn't be able to have pasta. Or if you don't have a bowl, you can't have soup. If you don't have an oven, then you can't bake bread. You'd have to have pancakes instead. So these things are affecting the way that people act, basically. And that can be said for kind of, I don't know, more cerebral, abstract things like relationships and religion. And I would argue that relationships of people, social relationships and interactions within the town are manifested in urban features. Yeah, both acting and being acted on by the material that they're bringing into the town. And this is the way that we can look at the archaeology and investigate the early history of the town. I should add at this point that while the historical record of Anglo-Saxon England is pretty good, the historical record for Anglo-Saxon Ipswich is not very good. Although we have really good archaeological evidence of the town going back to the 7th century, at least as a cemetery, its first mention in historical records is not until it's brought up in Anglo-Saxon Chronicle right at the end of the 10th century. Okay. So what this also allows us to do, I hope, is to get beyond this kind of top versus bottom or planned versus unplanned dichotomy and think about the relationships more broadly. I will say that discourse analysis has Foucauldian origins, although I confess that my interpretation is maybe a bit removed than what Foucault had anticipated. But basically, the insight of the discourse analysis is that every social interaction is basically, or fundamentally, a conversation between, or a conversation of power and a negotiation of power. And for Foucault, power isn't only repressive. It isn't just power to oppress. It can also, or actually is always in some way creative. And I think nowadays we tend to have a negative connotation of power. Power corrupts. But at the same time, we also understand that we don't want to be powerless. And there isn't just power to, enslave. There's also power to, build a town. There's power to build a causeway. There's power to, make a dinner. There's power to do creative and constructive things as well. And that's a useful thing. Now, of course, I'm abandoning, Foucault still had a sort of hierarchical approach to this, which isn't really appropriate for Anglo-Saxon England, if it is appropriate for the modern world. But also, Foucault was trying to talk about what made modern power specific and unique. And so it isn't relevant in that way to Anglo-Saxon England. So we need to historicize the way that power works for a pre-modern society. So looking at that, we can talk about different types of power coming from a kind of psychological perspective, which is different maybe than the way we're accustomed to thinking about power from political philosophy. So that basically power is just the ability to influence someone. And unlike Foucault's power, which is kind of omnipresent, power really is situational, right? So sometimes you can persuade people to go get their vaccines or wear a mask, and sometimes you're not able to. And power operates at different scales, but when it operates at different scales, it's often qualitatively and not just quantitatively different. And one of the ways that it can be different, and this is maybe only one example, is that the difference of power exercised by strangers versus power exercised through personal relations. So it's the difference between someone persuading you to wear a mask at the grocery store because it's the law, or because someone, the prime minister, or someone in the state, or someone in some legitimated position of authority has told you that that's what to do, versus someone who is, your grandmother or your daughter or whatever, telling you to act in a certain way because they're concerned for your own health and safety. Both of those are a type of power. They're both creative. They're both a discourse that happen at a moment of kind of interpersonal interaction, but they're qualitatively different. And once we kind of dissect power and deconstruct it and think of it in this kind of different way, then we can think about the way that power behaves specific to Anglo-Saxon England. And thus we can think about it in a historicized way, and social reactions generally in a historicized way. But one of the main things that is also a final insight of Foucault's is this kind of idea of social norm being a way of power. The power isn't always coercive, but is also just etiquette and shame and manners and so on. Yeah. Now, I don't have the time to go through this in the detail it deserves. It may be a topic for a whole nother talk. But to understand this, really, you have to historicize all of the types of classes of people. And of course, all these classes of people have different agents with their own different ambitions and aims and internal contradictions. But nonetheless, by breaking it down into the types of people who are at these emporia, then we can begin to think about the way that this is manifested in the growth of the town. So yes, kings, priests, but also churls, seafarers, and so on. Okay. So for the last, how long do we have? 30, 40, kind of 20-ish minutes of the presentation, we're going to see how this works in action. So I'm going to take as an example, not the Buttermarket Cemetery, I'll return to it, but Franciscan Way, which is this settlement here, located along the Old River Gipping, which was excavated in 1990. I will mention that the Old River Gipping no longer exists in Ipswich. It's underneath the town now. Okay. So this space changed actually quite a bit, and the stratigraphy is reasonably good here compared to many of the other excavations in Ipswich. In the first phase, this is sort of the 7th century phase when it was just 2 Grubenhäuser and 2 cemeteries. There was just a well, right? It was actually the only well excavated in Ipswich dating to this period. It's tree ring dated to 688. And its area is down by the river, so it may have been a sort of grazing area. It may be that there was some structure or household or something just off the excavation ascent, south of the excavation. But otherwise, we have what we would call open space, or at least as far as the archaeological evidence can attest to it. By the kind of middle of the 8th century, by about 750, the space changed, and we have 3 ditches that run through it, and a new well. The well's changed location. The ditch actually cuts the old well. And these ditches could be a plot, but I actually suspect that they are flood control channels used as sort of a flood prevention, or flood mitigation, because the Old River Gipping used to flood, as does the modern River Gipping up until the 20th century. Flooding was a massive problem, and so this makes sense. But we also maybe get a picture here where we have a kind of material negotiation. You have, maybe grazers or people who were using this well, kind of having a discourse with the people who have built these ditches. And maybe the ditches are built for the benefit of the entire town, but perhaps that interrupts the mobility or movement through the space of the herders that were there in the previous phase, up until perhaps 750. Now, a kind of old school way of interpreting this might be, okay, well, here we have some public features that are for the benefit of the wider community, and the type of power that, or the type of agent that would do that must be something like a state or legitimate authority, or something that has the entire community in its mind. But that isn't necessarily the case if we look at it historically. We know from Anglo-Saxon charters that there were expectations and responsibilities of owning land. And that if you owned a piece of land, you were expected to do things like maintain bridges and maintain strongholds that wouldn't have been only to the benefit of you, the landowner, but to the entire kingdom, who had to travel through the area or potentially needed defense. So this isn't necessarily a king saying, oh, I'm creating a town and my big project is going to be building flood control channels. It could be, but it also definitely could be just the person who owns this area of land. And then through the following phases, kind of over generational periods, 30, 40 years, there's just a series of replacements for the ditch, which is another reason why I think these are flood control channels, because they're kind of being washed out and they have to be redug. We're quite lucky because all the ditches cut each other just a little bit, so we can work out their stratigraphy. Every time a new ditch is dug, a new well is dug as well, which is interesting. But by this last phase, in the first half of the 9th century, there are a whole new series of pits. And in these pits are combined, from this phase in particular, 11 kilograms of slag. So that suggests that there, which is a decent amount, it's just there could be some ironworking here. Unfortunately, there's no direct evidence of it in the excavation extent. There's no forges or anything like that. And ultimately, when we look at archaeology, we're looking at a taskscape of deposition, not necessarily a taskscape of production. We can't necessarily make a one-to-one connection from blacksmithing to slag. But I do think this probably was either on or nearby a blacksmithing taskscape, because in the next 50 years, from 850 to 900, we have actually forges and pits with loads and loads of slag in it. Actually, within this whole phase, just within this 40-year period, there's 141 kilograms of slag, which is an enormous amount, even compared to other emporia. And it has structures that are associated with this as well. So we have perhaps a blacksmithing taskscape beginning in the first half of the 9th century, and then intensifying with structural and supportive tools in the second half of the 9th century. Also, at the same time that within the same 40-year period that these structures are built, a new road appears going through, which is the predecessor of the modern-day Franciscan way. We know that because we have the metalled surface of the road. It's graveled. And the road seems to run basically right alongside that ditch. And roadside ditches are really common in Anglo-Saxon England and in Ipswich in particular. And this actually creates an interesting picture. And this is a story that I propose here, which is that these ditches were indeed flood control channels, and they were probably built along the length of at least part of the River Gipping going northwards to just protect the rest of the settlement from being damaged from flooding. Yeah. Once the flood control channels were built, anyone who was at the waterfront and wanted to travel upriver would have kind of bumped into the flood control channels. So someone who wanted to walk up the river would have ended up walking along the flood control channels instead, going up what would eventually be Franciscan Way, either to go upriver, to go to Coddenham, like it says on the top of the map, or something. Yeah, but they're basically walking their own route, kind of like someone who walks along the railway track, or someone who walks along the canal, someone's walking along the flood control channel. But as more and more people do this, then perhaps they're sort of treading a path, yeah? And as they tread the path, they knock down grass. An informal trackway emerges, because once you have an informal trackway, then more people will use that path because they see that it's a path that you can take. And you know how this sort of works. Then once you have that, more people will walk on it, which treads the grass further, making it even more kind of a permanent feature. And through a kind of feedback loop, a virtuous cycle, a kind of informal roadway appears going along the canals. Yeah, and it may be that the informal trackway is what was present already here in the first half of the 9th century when the blacksmithing happened. Yeah, if it's informal, if it's just treaded grass, then we probably wouldn't have the archaeological, tools to see it. It's not entirely satisfactory because sometimes archaeologists are able to find, evidence of like carts or things kind of coming through, but not always. It certainly could be an informal trackway. What may have happened is that as people through the first half of the 9th century, travelers, I should say, the first half of the 9th century made their way up and down the flood control channel to move from the river into the settlement. Eventually, blacksmiths came and opportunistically began to work and trade from here because they were along a route, an artery of potential customers, basically. Also, anyway, it's near the river, it's away from the settlement, it's less likely to cause fire. There's a lot of historical evidence to suggest that, well, not a lot, but there's some historical evidence to suggest that blacksmiths would work away from the center of the settlement, kind of existing in outfields. So that kind of fixed the picture. And then eventually, as the industry kind of grew, someone came along and legitimated it, right? So they say, okay, now here we have a road, and now here we have structures and forges. And I kind of like to think of going from an informal trackway to a metalled road as being sort of the difference of writing in pencil and writing in pen, sort of materially making permanent or perennial the activities that are already going on there. And it may be a sort of stamp of approval from a legitimate authority. We think back to those kings, right? They're saying, okay, this is an activity you were doing, but now I'm sort of approving this and saying, yes, this is activity that I support, so much so that I'm going to, use my resources to have a thoroughfare built through here. Okay, since we have a time, let's look back at the Buttermarket Cemetery. So remember, we go from abandoned cemetery to structures in a road, two roads. What's really interesting about these two roads in the phase 2, in the 790 to 820 picture, is that the St. Stephen's Lane to the east is metalled, but the Market Lane is not. In fact, in the excavation report, it's not actually considered a road. It's considered maybe like a conduit or something for water. I think it is a road though, because these kind of boardwalks, these parallel post holes go right up to it, and we have a structure lining to it. But perhaps more persuasively than that is that in the following phase, again, just like at Franciscan Way, the road is metalled. So what was a conduit becomes this surface with gravel. Now, this is, again, the same time as the metalled road appears at Franciscan Way. This metalled road appears at the Buttermarket Cemetery. This is sort of 860 to 900. All right. Also note that the plots change for sort of the fourth time. The structures move again. These structures possibly disappear. Maybe some remain, but this one replaces the two structures that were here. The kiln is gone, replaced by some forges, actually. And this slot may actually be a ditch separating two plots again. The types of activities present are also different, right? It's gone from pottery to metalworking. Around the forge are crucibles and also the bright green corrosion flecks, which I understand are indicative of coppersmithing. So we kind of go from a pottery activity here to a coppersmithing activity here. Again, almost every generation, the plots and the activities kind of shift in this cemetery area, or the former cemetery area. It's also worth noting that when Market Lane is metalled, which is the western road, the eastern road is a new layer. And it's not just that it was maintained, is that a second layer was built on top of the first layer of road, which isn't actually super common. And it's a different type of material. It's less sandy and more gravelly. But it makes two distinct layers in the archaeology for two distinct kind of phases of road, which are roughly contemporary, within the same 40-year period at least, and maybe exactly contemporary to the metalling of Market Lane. Yeah. Again, this isn't necessarily a matter of royal imposition. It could be that people are maintaining their own roads. That is something that we see in Anglo-Saxon charters indirectly. And having a graveled road may have come to been seen as something specific to being an urban community. That people who live in a town think, yes, we are the kind of people that live with graveled roads. And just like building a bridge was the public duty of someone who owned land in some Anglo-Saxon charters, it may be that metalling a road, or maintaining a road at least, was seen as the public duty, or maybe even a kind of premature civic duty of a person that lived in an emporium or a very early Anglo-Saxon town. And I think I'm just going to go through very quickly Fore Street, which is in this area here, excavated in 1979. Unfortunately, only the kind of upper northeastern corner of the excavation extent had a good stratigraphy, and even then it's not that great. But within the kind of 40-year period that comes at the end, this structure, 3157, was maybe knocked down and replaced by a road, again, metalled road, kind of sort of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy style. What we maybe see is that someone's house has been knocked down to make way for a thoroughfare for traffic to go through. This isn't necessarily the case. It may be that, because this is within a 40-year time period, it may be that the structure and just outlived its natural life. These structures ostensibly didn't have very long lifetimes. So it may just be that actually the structure had been out of use for 30 years when the road was built anyway. But if it is the former story, then that definitely seems like that old school kind of planned town. Even when we take all the precautions we've had, it seems that someone says the plan is for a road to go here, and this structure is in the way, so we're going to knock it down. Okay. What's really interesting is when you put all these sites together, we do get at least some kind of picture in common, which is that all of the roads that existed in Ipswich that have been excavated, that we know of and can attest to archaeologically, by the year 900 were metalled. Yeah, so they had all these gravel surfaces. And we actually have 5 instances across Ipswich in which a road starts out as being a trackway. I guess we really have 3 instances. A road starts out as being a trackway and then is replaced over with gravel as a metalled road. And all of the metalled roads had either a renewing or a first appearance between the year 860 and 900. And it very well could be that there was a single project that was to metal all the roads, that some king, maybe in the year 880 or something, possibly Guthlac, decided that he was going to metal all the roads as his kind of royal project for Ipswich to make it a more impressive and permanent part of his kingdom. Certainly that kind of late 9th century period corresponds to Alfred the Great's kind of program of building burhs around Wessex. So it would kind of make sense comparably for the degree of power and a kind of legitimated state would have in Anglo-Saxon England. Okay. So this takes us back to our kind of story of going from emporium to a town. If we look back at that kind of beginning phase, 700, 750, we may find is maybe horizontal isn't the right word, but certainly not vertical discourses and occupations at the limit of the social norms. And if we, one way of thinking about this is when we look back to all of the changes, almost kind of generational reshuffling of the plots and structures and workshops above the Buttermarket Cemetery. Something similar happened at Stoke Quay as well, and to some extent at the other major or large area excavations in Ipswich, as we see this kind of reshuffling. Up until about 850, and then it becomes a bit more consistent. And although maybe the workshops sometimes change, the plots always seem to be about the same. And certainly an historian of later medieval and early modern towns, or certainly early modern and late modern towns, would know that plots are actually quite sticky and they're quite difficult to change plots in a town. At most, plots might be subdivided or amalgamated, but once plots come into existence, they tend to stay. But that wasn't the case in the 8th and early 9th century in Ipswich. Instead, we see that plots sort of changing with each generation. And that may be because the social norms about how to town, basically, hadn't been created yet. They hadn't appeared. And that basically the people who were living and performing, if you will, Ipswich in the 8th century, were acting on the social norms that had already existed for generations on a non-urban, far-spaced kind of agrarian society, or at least a pre-urban society in some way. And they didn't have the social norms about how to have those particular plots, about a particular way of behaving. But then those kind of manifested and ossified and became more permanent as time went on. And eventually people came up with an etiquette, if not a law. There's no Anglo-Saxon law really about town planning, but maybe an etiquette about how plots should be maintained and about how it should be passed on and how if you abandon a plot, they shouldn't come and take it over and someone should be able to play around and completely change it. But if you abandon a plot, that your successor can just build whatever they wish to, but only within the forms of their plot, right? So what may have happened is that in the beginning, the emporium was kind of at the limits of the social norm. People didn't really know what the etiquette was, perhaps like how the World Wide Web was in the 1990s and 2000s, until finally it just kind of became a kind of common practice, right? And same may have happened with kind of these urban behaviors, right? And by the year 900, perhaps that's being manifested in, people maintaining their own gravel roads and people sticking to their plots. That could also be interpreted as marks of authority, and they're probably kind of mutually enforcing, or at least combined in some kind of messy way, where a legitimate authority reinforces, or sometimes maybe introduces tries to introduce a social norm, a way to behave. Yeah. Okay. So getting into our conclusion here, part of the problem with understanding this story from getting from a not town into a town is actually maybe the word town itself. Now, obviously, the word town has its place and is a useful and meaningful word in numerous ways, and we should continue using the word town. But town is fundamentally a label that historians and archaeologists and indeed non-specialists and people across all the disciplines more or less use to describe a complex system that includes food webs, behaviors, interactions, relationships, production, storage, trade, so on. And really, it's a whole bunch of components acting together in a particular way that is town-like. It's also worth noting that the word town didn't take on its current meaning in English until the 10th century. And really, in Old English, in contemporary Old English, so in the kind of middle Old English, there wasn't really a word to distinguish a town other than wick, which is used, or port, P-O-R-T, either of which are used to translate emporium, like from Bede. And the word town didn't take its current meaning until the 10th century. And town used to mean just an enclosure, basically. The idea is that town is an enclosed settlement. But interestingly, throughout the entire period we're looking at, Ipswich was never enclosed, that, as far as we can tell, as an entire settlement until the 10th century. But does it mean that we shouldn't call it a town? So this leads me to this kind of final perspective of looking at the story of the town, which is, of course, that the town emerges out of all these different components that go together and create a single thing in a complex kind of non-linear way that interact in a way. I guess that's, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So basically, all this research that we've talked about, or I've talked about over the last 45 minutes, has been really about social interactions and relationships, which are just two components of the town, and how people basically start with one type of MO of social interactions and relationships, and then that kind of changes and emerges and interacts with the material of the town, with the people in the town, to create a town in the end. But other types of components can also be looked at to study towns, right? You can look at food webs. It's kind of what Pam Crabtree was done with Ipswich, and this is kind of what urban ecologists have been doing for a long time, about how towns are these kind of black holes that suck energy and biomass out of the surrounding environment, where they're burned as fuel or something, and then kind of don't make it back into the ecosystem. Or you could look at the behavior of towns, about how people have particular ways of behaving that emerges in an urban way, or particularly urban types of production, or particularly urban types of culture, by which in this case I mean particular traditions of antler working, or particular traditions of house construction or something. And all these things spontaneously emerge as a town, perhaps with guidance or support from a king, but not necessarily as a cause and effect strictly related to the king only. And all these allow for all sorts of interesting little stories and knitways and a kind of complex, messy web of cause and effect. If, for example, you could make a very similar diagram to this, where all these little circles were organelles and the big green circle on top is a cell, or all these little circles on the bottom are organ systems, and all the big green circle on the top is an organism. Same thing is basically all these things are interacting in a specific way to create a town. And then again, we have this kind of mutual nonlinear feedback loop where all these systems bring food and fuel and goods and services to the town. And in turn, the town gives commercial behavior, interaction, storage, defense, and customers back to these systems, which encourages them to bring yet more food and fuel and goods and services, which makes the town yet a better place for customers and storage and defense and so on, in a kind of positive loop, and the town emerges. So to conclude, To understand the emergence of a town from this kind of non-town place on the estuary with 2 cemeteries and 2 Grubenhäuser into a town that went on to continue to the 21st century, we need to deconstruct what early medieval urbanism is. Town can almost become this kind of analytical black box that we fail to deconstruct and understand, but we need to actually take it apart, look at the components, and study those components on their own. There's also merit in studying the system as itself, and I'm not a complex system scientist or anything like that. But if you're listening to this, you're welcome to take this on. And also, we need to look beyond this kind of planned versus organic dichotomy to understand urban growth. So instead of just looking at king versus merchant, we need to consider, well, there's king and there's merchant and there's craftsman and there's herder and there's blacksmith or something like this. This isn't perfect, and the archaeology is never going to let us understand like a kind of game theory where we have all these different agents and we know what all they want to do. But it at least gives us a better and more realistic and really more interesting and dynamic story about urban growth instead of just this kind of two-pronged approach. If nothing else, the story of Ipswich is far more complex than just a story of foundational entrepreneurship. Yeah. And one of the conclusions that I can get out of this is that behaviors in relationship emerge spontaneously and are later enforced. And it's only some of the relationships. Obviously, there are loads that can't be attested for archaeologically, or maybe could be by an archaeologist smarter than I am, or maybe one day in the future, archaeology will find better tools for doing so. But at least we can get at some of them, and we can try to build a picture with what evidence we have available, which is ultimately the material evidence of Ipswich, to create a picture of how the town emerged. So I'll conclude with this remark, which is that it basically took about 200 years to get from what looks like other emporia, it looks like London Wick or Jaffa Wick or Reba or something like this, into something that looks more like an late Anglo-Saxon town like Londonderry or Winchester or something like this. And all of these components aren't just founded. It shouldn't be a question of foundation. We're used to saying, okay, New York City was founded in 1624 or whatever. But this is rather more something of it's gradually emerging, reciprocating, sometimes, getting kind of non-linear causal feedback loop by copying other emporia or by encouraging, traders to come or whatever it is. And over 200 years, eventually a town spontaneously emerges from an emporium. And therein exists, of course, the expression Rome wasn't built in a day. So if y'all are looking for a kind of more local post-Brexit version of that, then I would offer Ipswich wasn't built in a day, because Ipswich needs to have the archaeological attention that deserves to help us understand this complex story of how towns appeared in early medieval Britain going forward. So that's my talk. I will leave you back over to the caring hands of Kai.
Thank you so much for that, Brandon. That was really, really interesting. I guess now for the remaining time, we'd like to open the discussion to our guests. So does anyone have any questions for Brandon?
Sorry, we got one from Deirdre. Yeah, I'll unmute her.
Yep, Deirdre.
Yep. I'd like the word you didn't use in all of this is one that I think becomes so crucial in the development of towns, and that's property. So how is it could only be speculative. I know there isn't any data that you could use that would consider how property becomes what it is and how it's transferred. But perhaps you could speculate, since you've covered an awful lot in your 200 years, as to where you think a property horizon might arrive in this agenda.
It's an exciting question because I've just been looking at the new excavation, and it may have pushed my answer back a little bit earlier than I perhaps at first thought. So I know from Anglo-Saxon charters that property was conceived, like land property was already conceived at the beginning of this period, or at least in the 7th century. And I think the change maybe is the kind of the plotting of the spaces, and that the plotting becomes a kind of permanent property to be transferred instead of just kind of erasing it and leaving the land set for a new plot with different things to appear. But there are a couple places in Ipswich where even in the middle of the 8th century, it seems like the plots are being respected. It may be that started out as being kind of like rented land, and that is sort of attested to in some of the Anglo-Saxon laws. So based off of when the plots become more permanent and the mention of the kind of renting of land in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I would probably say the 8th century. Which, yeah.
It's interesting. That's pretty early. I mean,
it is.
By the 10th century, we can see it in the succession of property plots in Jorvik and I'm sure elsewhere. Jorvik, it's been well identified. But pushing it back to the 8th century is interesting because it suggests that it's that whole question of assigning a value that is transferable and a right that exists in actual ownership of property, which obviously can be turned into a rental as well, but they both represent, if you like, an occupational right. That is actually in an urban place, because that seems to me to be quite important. You know, that you create something that can be transferred as a commercial unit, or as a valued unit. I might use the word commercial specifically there, but something that has an assigned value.
Yeah. I don't know. It may just be that the process happened earlier in the towns and then spread outwards into the hinterland rather than vice versa. But I don't know, this idea that land is commodifiable is already apparent in Anglo-Saxon charters, I think by the 8th century even. Yeah.
Okay. We have another question from David Edwards. Yeah, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please, David.
Hiya. Thanks very much. That's really interesting. All sorts of ways. A couple of things. I like the roadway. Yes, so a trackway turning into a roadway or something. This sort of metalling process. And it's not something I know enough about. But am I right? Ipswich itself is built on gravel. So if you want, you can dig the gravel in pits. As soon as you start digging pits, you produce gravel, or does it have to be brought in for the metalling? Do you know? If I just say, I mean, that some experience of digging Cambridge, I suddenly realised that so many of these pits in people's backyards in Cambridge plots, rather later in the medieval period, they're producing gravel, which you can put on the trackways and the laneways and things like this. And
I don't know, and I thank you for asking, because that'd be a really interesting thing to investigate. What I do know is that there are loads and loads and loads of pits in early medieval and in later medieval Ipswich, and basically in people's plots. So if it is that they're finding gravel there, then that would be a very handy kind of secondary use, or maybe even primary use for the pit, is to get the gravel out and to metal the road. That definitely could be.
Yes, so just that thing about the practicalities of how you land up metaling roads. It did take it one step further if you have to go and get the stuff rather than it's sort of to hand.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can I just ask a supplementary? I was interested the very early of this as a beach fair or whatever.
Yeah.
That whole thing of that first thing when you're saying that first stage of the process is this is going to be a seasonal activity. Is turning a seasonal site potentially into a more permanent site, and how that's a sort of very early. I mean, it's like turning a trackway, a walkway into a road.
Right.
And I was just suddenly thinking, something I hadn't actually thought about, that fairs, all sorts of fair places, turning it into a place which is becoming permanent is also a really interesting issue. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that. But.
I didn't really bring it up very well in the presentation, actually. But yeah, the general idea is that these emporia began is only in the summer, that people are meeting on the beach and then going away in the harvest to do their agriculture, whatever they're doing. But that maybe eventually having the infrastructure there encourages people to stay longer, or there's competition for better spaces. And then people stay a little bit later into the harvest, 2 weeks later, or come 2 weeks earlier in the spring. I think people have similar ideas about like going from kind of part-time growing of cereals to round-the-year growing of cereals for like the agricultural revolution. So if there's something like that could be happening here. Yeah, I definitely think so. I think this kind of emergence where you have this kind of positive feedback loop is a really common characteristic in the history of a town. So, thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
The next question is by Andrew Merrill. So yeah, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please, Andy.
Hi, thanks for that. Sorry, it's just my head appearing at the bottom of the screen. I really enjoyed that. It was a very interesting way of thinking about things. I was wondering if I could ask a kind of slightly wanky ancient history question and talk about the kind of imaginative importance of towns as well. You may have been there amongst the kind of cluster of little cells of the things that go into making up a town. But it's not just about kind of social behaviours, is it? There's also this idea that collectively we are part of something called a town. We have urbanity, in fact, which is what that implies. And that was something that Caroline brought up quite well, I think, last week in talking about early medieval urbanism, even as these things dramatically change. And although there isn't, as you say, the kind of Old English language for urbanism takes a while to develop, and there are lots of different terms kind of occupying that exist simultaneously. We have got Latin terms like urbs and civitas, which are in use, and there's a huge imaginative variety of towns, I think, whether known in terms of kind of practical context across the North Sea or elsewhere in the British Isles, or through texts like the Bible. And I wondered about the degree to which that also has a kind of active agency in behaviour, whether it is the kind of a king deciding, okay, what I want in my kingdom is this kind of new created settlement that I can call a town, or the inhabitants of the town themselves feeling that we have to start assuming some of these trappings that we've heard about in other places or have seen in other places.
I like that a lot. Yeah, it's like the label has, like I said, has its own agency, and so we think, oh, now that I know what a town is, I need to make sure that my town checks all the boxes, or our town checks all the boxes, and so we need to make sure that we also have a gravelled road and, I don't know, a big ditch around the town or something. Definitely could be, and you're right. There were Latin texts written in Latin in Anglo-Saxon England, like the History of the English by Bede. And it calls London a metropolis. And a civitas. Those words are used to describe emporia, not even really towns, not even things that are like would be called a town by an archaeologist, but like an emporium. So I think that's probably a really good point. I like that. Thank you. Yeah, probably even the label itself is part of that. One of those agents causing the town to appear.
Well, it's also possible that different inhabitants of the town are thinking about it in different ways. So there's this whole variety of different kind of modes of understanding of precisely what it is we're doing here, what this project actually involves. And that might also be contested and changing over time.
Yeah, definitely. No, I like that. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Professor Neil Christie, and I know you've been in good contact with local archaeologists, but does it matter at all if you have not dug in Ipswich personally? For example, the nuances in the stratigraphy, for example, etc. Yeah,
I bet it unfortunately does. Like you say, I am in touch with these people, and I try to get questions through them. But for example, David's question about the gravel, for example, is maybe something I would have known if I'd excavated there, but I don't. But it's something I can ask them. I'm not sure if I can give any more detail to my answer. It's not the end of the world. It doesn't make the research impossible, but I'm sure it would be just that much better and easier if I had excavated there. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Okay. So I guess if there's no more further questions, we'll end the meeting here. So thank you so much for attending, everyone. And if you'd like to speak to Brandon again, I'm sure we can drop his social media in there as well. All right, great. Thank you, everyone. And hope you all have a lovely evening. And we'll see you again, I believe, next week.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.